They dragged her into the courtroom in chains, her matted hair and tattered clothes drawing disgusted glances from everyone present. The prosecutor smirked as he called her just another homeless nuisance who needed to be removed from decent society. Her court-appointed lawyer barely looked up from his phone. When asked her name, she spoke for the first time, voice surprisingly clear. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters. The judge began his standard lecture about wasting court time with false claims until he saw her military ID. His face drained of color. The gavel dropped from his hand. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories about honor that goes unrecognized, please consider subscribing for more. The fluorescent lights of San Diego Central Courthouse cast their unforgiving glow across the worn wooden benches and scuffed linoleum floors. Morning docket was in full swing, a steady parade of minor offenses being processed with assembly line efficiency. Attorneys moved in and out, their expressions varying between boredom and mild annoyance at the predictable rhythm of their days. Court clerks shuffled papers, bailiffs maintained order, and Judge Malcolm Garrett presided over it all with brisk efficiency. At 52, Judge Garrett had the bearing of someone who had spent significant time in military service before turning to law. His silver-gray hair was cut short, his black robes pressed to perfection, and his gaze sharp as he surveyed his domain. A former Navy JAG officer, he had earned a reputation for running a tight courtroom, fair but uncompromising, with little patience for wasted time or weak excuses. Next case, he called, glancing at the docket before him without looking up as the courtroom doors opened. The sound that followed was distinctive, the unmistakable rattle of chains accompanied by shuffling footsteps. The scent arrived next, causing several people in the first row to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The subtle reaction rippled through the gallery as the latest defendant was led in by a bailiff who maintained a careful distance, his expression professionally blank but nostrils slightly flared. "Jane Doe number 647, announced Court Clerk Phelps, her voice carrying the slight nasal quality of someone trying not to breathe too deeply. Charges of criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Oliver Preston straightened his already impeccable tie and rose with the confident posture of someone on a career trajectory. At 31, he viewed these morning misdemeanor proceedings as dues to be paid before moving on to felony cases and eventual political aspirations. His suit was expensive but not ostentatious, his haircut precise, his smile practiced to perfection when needed. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor," he stated, sparing only the briefest glance toward the defendant now being guided to the table opposite his. She was small, made smaller by her hunched posture, and the way her oversized donated clothing hung from her frame. What might have once been dark hair was now a matted tangle streaked with premature gray, partially hidden beneath a stained knit cap pulled low. Her face remained downcast, features obscured, but her hands were visible, reddened, chapped, with surprisingly clean short nails. The chains around her wrists seemed unnecessarily heavy for someone of her size and apparent frailty. Next to her, scrambling to organize a haphazard stack of manila folders, stood Dominic Ward. At 45, the public defender's face carried the permanent creases of someone perpetually short on sleep and long on caseload. His suit had seen better days. His reading glasses were held together with tape at one hinge, and his expression was that of a man already planning his arguments for the next 3 cases while barely focusing on the current one. "Defense is, ready as well, Your Honor," Ward stated, finally locating the correct folder and flipping it open. Judge Garrett glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:17 a.m., right on schedule. "Mr. Preston, present your case." Preston stepped forward, adopting the tone he reserved for what he privately termed vagrant violations. Professional, but with an undercurrent that suggested the case was barely worth the court's time. "Your Honor, on Tuesday, April 12th, at approximately 7:30 a.m., park maintenance workers discovered the defendant sleeping on the grounds of the Naval Memorial in Coronado. When asked to vacate the premises, she became agitated, claiming she had a right to be there. When police officers arrived to remove her, she resisted, making incoherent statements about service and duty. Preston glanced at his notes, though it was clear he had already memorized the relevant details. "This is the defendant's 3rd incident at military installations in the past month. She was previously removed from the Veterans Affairs building on Pacific Highway and from outside the Naval Base San Diego main gate. In both prior instances, she was given warnings rather than citations, but this pattern of behavior suggests warnings are insufficient. At the defense table, Jane Doe, number 647, remained motionless, eyes fixed on some invisible point on the table before her. The chains at her wrists clinked softly as she shifted her weight. The prosecution recommends 30 days custody with psychological evaluation, Preston concluded. Clearly, there are mental health issues that need addressing, and the defendant presents an ongoing nuisance to our military and memorial sites. Judge Garrett nodded, then turned his attention to the defense table. Mr. Ward, your response? Ward cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the file he had clearly not reviewed until this moment. Yes, Your Honor, my client is experiencing housing insecurity, as is evident. While the locations of her trespassing are noteworthy, there's no indication of any damage or threat to these facilities. He flipped through a few more pages, searching for something substantive to offer. I believe my client may be a veteran herself, though documentation is unavailable at this time. If that's the case, her presence at these locations may reflect an attempt to access services rather than criminal intent. Judge Garrett's expression suggested he found this argument tenuous at best. Does your client have a name, Mr. Ward, or any identifying information that might substantiate this claim of veteran status? Ward leaned over and whispered something to the defendant, who remained unresponsive. After an awkward moment, he straightened and addressed the court again. I've been unable to establish consistent communication with my client, Your Honor. She was assigned to me just 30 minutes before this hearing. The intake sheet lists her only as Jane Doe. From the gallery came a barely audible snicker, quickly silenced by a sharp look from the bailiff. Preston maintained his professional demeanor, but couldn't quite suppress the slight upward turn at the corner of his mouth. Judge Garrett studied the defendant more carefully now. Something about her stillness struck him as unusual, not the vacant disconnection often seen in those with severe mental illness or addiction, but a controlled, deliberate stillness. Does the defendant wish to speak on her own behalf? He asked, directing the question to her rather than through her attorney. For the first time, there was a visible reaction, the slightest tension in her shoulders, a minute adjustment of her posture that, to most observers, would have gone unnoticed. But Judge Garrett had spent years reading body language, first in the military and then in his courtroom. That small shift registered as significant. Still, she remained silent, head bowed, eyes downcast. Preston seized the opportunity to press his advantage. Your Honor, given the defendant's inability or unwillingness to cooperate with even basic identification, the prosecution's recommendation of custody with psychiatric evaluation becomes even more appropriate. We need to determine who she is and whether she represents a risk to herself or others, particularly given her fixation on military installations. Ward finally seemed to engage more fully with his client's case. Your Honor, a psychiatric evaluation may indeed be appropriate, but it should be conducted through the VA system or county health services, not in custody. Incarceration would only traumatize someone already in a vulnerable state. As the attorneys continued their discussion, Bailiff Reynolds, a Vietnam-era veteran himself, observed the defendant with growing interest. Despite her disheveled appearance, her hands had settled into a distinctive position on the table before her, fingers slightly spread, palms down, right thumb slightly overlapping the left, a formal, at-ease position taught in certain military units. Judge Garrett noticed it too, his attention drawn to this inconsistency between her appearance and her bearing. Before I rule on this matter, I need the defendant's actual identity for the record. We can't continue to process someone with no confirmed name. He addressed the defendant directly again. Ma'am, I need you to state your name for the court. The courtroom fell quiet. The routine efficiency of the morning docket momentarily paused as all attention focused on the small, hunched figure in chains. Seconds passed, stretching into uncomfortable silence. Preston checked his watch impatiently. Ward shuffled his papers, already mentally moving on to his next case. Then, with startling clarity, she spoke. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters, United States Navy. The voice that emerged was rough from disuse, but carried the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to formal military communication, clear, precise, each syllable given proper weight. It was the voice of command, incongruous coming from someone in her current state. Preston couldn't suppress a slight eye roll, exchanging a knowing glance with the court clerk. They had heard similar claims before, homeless individuals appropriating military titles or claiming special forces backgrounds, usually as ploys for sympathy or special treatment. Your Honor, Preston began with barely concealed condescension. As I mentioned, delusions of military service are common in the transient population, especially those frequenting military sites. This claim should be evaluated as part of her psychiatric assessment. Judge Garrett raised his hand slightly to silence the prosecutor. Something about the name and rank tugged at his memory, not immediately recognizable, but stirring some distant recollection. "You claim to be Lieutenant Commander Winters," he said, addressing her directly again. "What was your unit assignment, Commander?" For the first time, she raised her head slightly, though her features remained partially obscured by the knit cap and the tangled hair framing her face. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Intelligence Support Activity." Preston couldn't contain himself. "Your Honor, this is unnecessary. We have actual cases to process this morning. Every other homeless vet claims special forces or intelligence. It's textbook confabulation." "I'll determine what's necessary in my courtroom, Mr. Preston," Judge Garrett responded, his tone cooler than before. He turned his attention back to the defendant. "That would place you with the SEALs, is that correct?" "Intelligence support, sir," she replied, her voice still carrying that unmistakable military precision. "I was not an operator. I provided mission-critical intelligence for special operations." Ward looked between his client and the judge with growing confusion, clearly surprised by both her sudden articulateness and the judge's unusual interest. He attempted to reassert his role. "Your Honor, if my client is indeed a veteran as she claims, there are specific diversion programs available rather than incarceration." Preston stepped forward again, visibly frustrated by this deviation from routine. "Your Honor, with all due respect, even if the defendant served in some capacity, which we have no proof of, it doesn't excuse criminal trespassing. Mental illness combined with substance abuse often creates these elaborate military fantasies, especially in those exposed to military culture." Bailiff Reynolds had moved closer to the defense table, his attention now fully focused on the defendant. As she shifted position slightly, the sleeve of her oversized jacket rode up, revealing a small but distinctive navy tattoo on her wrist, not the kind typically gotten on shore leave, but the more discreet marking sometimes seen among those in specialized units. Judge Garrett noticed it too. His expression changed subtly as pieces began connecting in his mind. "Lieutenant Commander, what can you tell me about the command structure of Naval Special Warfare Group during your service?" Without hesitation, she provided a detailed and technically precise answer about reporting hierarchies, using acronyms and terminology that would be unfamiliar to civilians, but was clearly accurate to anyone with knowledge of naval operations. The specificity and confidence of her response was jarring, coming from someone in her current condition. Preston's expression had shifted from annoyance to suspicion. "Your Honor, anyone can memorize military jargon from movies or the internet. This proves nothing except perhaps an unusual fixation on naval operations." "Mr. Preston," Judge Garrett responded with growing impatience, "I served as a JAG officer with the Navy for 17 years before joining the bench. I'm quite familiar with the difference between Hollywood jargon and accurate knowledge of naval command structures." He turned back to the defendant. "Does the defendant have any identification to support these claims?" For just a moment, a flash of something like frustration crossed what was visible of her face. "My identification was in my backpack, taken during arrest." Ward perked up at this, finally sensing something concrete he could work with. "Your Honor, if my client had identifying documents that were confiscated, we should retrieve those immediately. They would be essential to determining appropriate next steps." Preston's dismissive wave was immediate. "Standard procedure, Your Honor. Personal effects of those experiencing homelessness are inventoried and stored at the police station. They often contain unidentified substances or unsafe items. If there was legitimate military identification, it would have been noted in the arrest report." Judge Garrett considered this for a moment, then made a decision that deviated from his usual efficient process. "Officer Mendez," he addressed one of the court officers standing near the door. "Please go to the evidence room and retrieve this defendant's personal effects immediately. We'll address other matters on the docket while waiting." As Officer Mendez left to comply with this unusual mid-hearing request, whispers began spreading through the courtroom. The morning's routine had been disrupted, and the gallery, filled mostly with other defendants waiting their turn, a few attorneys, and the occasional observer, had taken notice. Some of the whispers carried clear mockery. "Homeless lady thinks she's G.I. Jane," and "Special Forces, right? And I'm the Queen of England." Others reflected growing curiosity about why the normally efficient Judge Garrett was taking such interest in what should have been a routine vagrant case. Ward used the unexpected break to finally attempt genuine communication with his client, leaning close and speaking in hushed tones. Preston remained at his table, visibly annoyed by the delay, but maintaining his professional composure while checking emails on his phone. Bailiff Reynolds approached the bench and spoke quietly to Judge Garrett. "Sir, I noticed something about her posture and hand positioning. Classic naval intelligence stance. And that tattoo on her wrist is specific to certain units. I had a buddy in naval intelligence during my time. Their markings were distinctive." Judge Garrett nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Reynolds. I noticed similar things. Let's see what her belongings tell us." Nearly 15 minutes passed before Officer Mendez returned, carrying a sealed evidence bag containing a weathered backpack. Judge Garrett instructed him to open it and inventory the contents publicly, a procedure typically done privately before hearings. "One sleeping bag, compressed," Mendez began, placing each item on a table as he named it. "One change of clothing, toothbrush and partial tube of toothpaste, water bottle, small first aid kit." The items were worn but meticulously organized, each in its own plastic bag to keep it clean and dry. Not the typical disarray of someone living on the streets. 3 protein bars, notebook, pen, Mendez continued, and 1 laminated card. He held up what appeared to be an official military identification card. Though weathered and clearly aged, the Navy insignia was visible even from the bench. Judge Garrett instructed him to bring it forward for inspection. Preston rose immediately. "Your Honor, even if this appears to be military identification, it could easily be forged or stolen. Many homeless individuals acquire discarded or lost identification." Judge Garrett took the card from Officer Mendez, examining it carefully. His expression shifted as he read the information it contained, then looked up at the defendant with new understanding. "This identifies you as Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters, Naval Intelligence, SEAL Team Support Activity," he stated, his tone now markedly different. "Service number and security clearance level consistent with your claimed position." For the first time since entering the courtroom, the defendant raised her head fully, meeting the judge's eyes directly. Despite the dirt smudging her face and the hollow cheeks suggesting long-term malnutrition, her gaze was steady and clear, intelligent, alert, and carrying a depth of experience at odds with her current circumstances. That direct eye contact triggered something in Judge Garrett's memory. A briefing he had attended years ago, a classified operation report, a name mentioned with unusual respect. His expression changed completely as recognition dawned. "Operation Broken Arrow," he said quietly. "Yemen, 2014. The defendant gave a barely perceptible nod, her eyes never leaving his. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, the observers sensing that something significant was happening without understanding what. Preston looked between the judge and the defendant with growing confusion, his confident demeanor faltering as he realized he had missed something crucial. Judge Garrett's next words shocked everyone present. "Clear the courtroom immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. Everyone except the defendant and essential court personnel. Preston rose immediately in protest. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "That was not a suggestion, Mr. Preston," Judge Garrett interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "This courtroom will be cleared now. We will resume the public docket in 1 hour." As confused spectators and court staff began filing out, murmuring among themselves about the unprecedented development, Judge Garrett's gaze remained fixed on the small, disheveled woman before him. The woman who had entered his courtroom in chains and rags, dismissed as just another homeless nuisance, was suddenly revealed to be something entirely different. Behind the dirt and despair was a naval officer whose name he recognized, someone who had served with distinction in operations so classified that even he, with his high-level JAG clearance, had only been briefed on portions. Someone who, by all rights, should have been receiving honors and benefits rather than sleeping rough at the very memorials established to recognize service like hers. As the last observers exited and the doors closed behind them, Judge Garrett addressed the bailiff. "Reynolds, remove those restraints immediately." The chains that had bound Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters fell away with a symbolic clatter, leaving her wrists bare, chapped, and marked with the red impressions of her bonds. She rubbed them absently, the first natural, unguarded gesture she had made since entering the courtroom. "My chambers," Judge Garrett directed, already removing his robes. Now, Judge Garrett's chambers presented a stark contrast to the clinical fluorescence of the courtroom. Warmth emanated from the wood-paneled walls adorned with naval memorabilia and framed law degrees. A large window overlooked the harbor, where Navy vessels occasionally passed, a daily reminder of his former life in service before donning judicial robes. Alexandra Winters sat with perfect posture in the leather chair opposite his desk, the chains removed but her appearance no less jarring in these dignified surroundings. The tattered clothing, the matted hair, the ingrained dirt of long-term homelessness, all remained, yet now that her military bearing had emerged, these external markers seemed more like a disguise than her true state. Ward had been dismissed despite his protests about client representation rights. Only Bailiff Reynolds remained, standing discreetly by the door, his own military background evident in his stance. "Would you like some water, Commander?" Judge Garrett asked, his tone dramatically transformed from the brisk judicial efficiency he'd displayed in court. The question carried genuine concern rather than mere courtesy. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Her voice retained the hoarseness of disuse, but the clarity and precision remained, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Judge Garrett nodded to Reynolds, who poured water from a pitcher on the credenza and brought it to her. She accepted it with steady hands, drinking with controlled sips rather than the desperate gulps one might expect from someone living on the streets. Silence hung between them as she drank, and the judge gathered his thoughts. When she had finished, she placed the glass carefully on the coaster provided, a small gesture of ingrained propriety that seemed to affect Judge Garrett more deeply than her formal speech or posture. "My brother was at the embassy in Sana'a during the siege," he said finally, his voice quiet but charged with emotion, carefully contained. "Commander James Garrett, naval attaché." Alexandra's eyes registered recognition, but she remained quiet, allowing him to continue. "You were the intelligence officer who identified the second attack wave," he continued. "Your warning gave them the 17 minutes they needed to evacuate the East Wing before the explosives detonated." For the first time, genuine emotion flickered across her features. A flash of pain quickly brought under control, but not before the judge had seen it. 22 personnel evacuated, she confirmed. 3 casualties but no fatalities in the second wave. "My brother was among those 22, Judge Garrett said. He never knew the name of the intelligence officer whose warning saved him. The operation details were classified beyond his clearance level. Alexandra nodded once, acknowledging this information without comment. Her hands remained perfectly still in her lap, neither fidgeting nor clenched, the practiced stillness of someone trained to control every aspect of their physical presence. "What I cannot understand," Judge Garrett continued, leaning forward slightly, "is how you went from that position, decorated naval intelligence officer with one of the highest clearance levels possible, to being arrested for trespassing at the very memorials established for service members like yourself." The directness of the question seemed to catch her off guard, a brief vulnerability showing through her controlled exterior. When she answered, her voice carried an undercurrent of resignation beneath its military precision. "Medical discharge, 2016, combat-related PTSD with dissociative episodes following an operation in Eastern Europe. Details remain classified." She recited this information as if reading from a file, distancing herself from its personal implications. "VA benefits became entangled in bureaucracy after my identity was flagged as involving classified service records." "Flagged?" Judge Garrett interrupted. "By whom?" "Unknown, sir. Requests for clarification were met with circular referrals between departments. My case officer changed 17 times in the first year. Eventually, my housing allowance and medical benefits were suspended, pending security review." A bitter edge had crept into her voice despite her evident control. "And your family? Other support networks?" "Parents deceased, no siblings. My unit connections were severed due to ongoing classification issues. Discussing operational details with former colleagues would constitute security violations. She paused, then added with brutal simplicity, "When you can't explain why you wake up screaming, conventional therapy options are limited." Judge Garrett absorbed this information with growing disbelief. "So, the system just let you fall through the cracks? Someone with your service record, your clearance level? The system is designed to protect classified information, sir, not the people who carry it." The statement held no self-pity, merely factual assessment. Once I became a potential security liability rather than an asset, containment became the priority. "And your descent into homelessness?" For the first time, she looked away, her gaze drifting to the harbor, visible through the window. "Gradual, savings depleted by medical costs not covered during the review period. Cognitive difficulties made civilian employment challenging. Without being able to discuss my actual work history or skills, interviews became exercises in creative fiction." She refocused on the judge. "I maintained Howe's status until 14 months ago. Since then, I've adapted to outdoor conditions." "And the military installations?" Judge Garrett asked gently. "The memorial where you were arrested?" The question elicited another flash of emotion, something like embarrassment quickly suppressed. "I still report to the memorial on duty days," she admitted. "Old habits. Tuesdays and Thursdays were my intelligence briefing schedule with the SEAL teams. The structure helps maintain temporal orientation." The simple admission, a decorated officer reduced to standing vigil at memorials because routine was the only stability left to her, landed like a physical blow. Judge Garrett's jaw tightened visibly as he processed the implications of her situation. Their conversation was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. Reynolds opened it to reveal his fellow bailiff, who leaned in to whisper something before departing. Reynolds approached the judge's desk. "Sir, there's a Captain Rhodes from Naval Base San Diego requesting immediate access. Says it's regarding the defendant and is time sensitive." Judge Garrett glanced at Alexandra, whose posture had subtly shifted at the name, a nearly imperceptible tensing that nevertheless communicated wariness. "You know Captain Rhodes?" he asked her. "Former chain of command connection, indirectly." The deliberately vague answer suggested complications beyond what she was willing to state openly. Judge Garrett considered this, then nodded to Reynolds. "Show Captain Rhodes in, but remain present." Minutes later, the door opened to admit a woman in her early 60s, her naval uniform impeccable, her bearing unmistakably that of senior command. Captain Eleanor Rhodes carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to deference, her silver-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression professionally neutral as she took in the scene before her. Any hope that Rhodes might not recognize Alexandra in her current state vanished immediately. Despite the dramatic transformation in appearance, Rhodes identified her instantly, her steps faltering almost imperceptibly before she recovered her composure. "Lieutenant Commander Winters," she acknowledged with formal military courtesy, despite the incongruity of addressing someone in such disheveled condition with a rank title. "You've been off our radar for some time." "That was intentional, Captain," Alexandra replied, her tone cooling noticeably. "Easier to disappear than explain." The tense exchange confirmed Judge Garrett's growing suspicion that there was much more to Alexandra Winters' story than a simple administrative failure. He rose from behind his desk, extending his hand to the naval officer. "Captain Rhodes, I'm Judge Malcolm Garrett. Thank you for responding so promptly to our inquiry." It was a deliberate mischaracterization. They had made no such inquiry, but the tactic worked. Rhodes accepted the handshake automatically, while processing the implication that the court had initiated this contact, rather than whatever had actually brought her here so quickly. "Of course, Your Honor. When we received word that Lieutenant Commander Winters had been identified in your courtroom, I felt it appropriate to respond personally. She has been, absent from required check-ins for some time." "Required check-ins?" Judge Garrett raised an eyebrow. "I was just hearing from the commander that her benefits were suspended and her case essentially abandoned by the system." Rhodes's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "There appears to have been some administrative confusion regarding her status. I'm here to help rectify that situation and ensure she receives appropriate support." The careful phrasing rang false to Judge Garrett's experienced ear. Before he could press further, Alexandra spoke, her voice carrying a calm certainty that belied her appearance. "Captain Rhodes isn't here out of concern for my welfare, Your Honor. Naval intelligence has likely been monitoring for any official system entries of my name or identification. My appearance in court records would have triggered automated alerts." Rhodes's expression confirmed this assessment, despite her attempt to maintain neutrality. "Your understanding of protocols remains excellent, Commander," she acknowledged. "Though your characterization of motives is unnecessarily cynical, the Navy doesn't abandon its own." 14 months on the street suggests otherwise," Alexandra replied evenly. Judge Garrett interjected before the tension could escalate further. "Captain Rhodes, I'm trying to understand how a decorated naval intelligence officer ended up homeless and apparently abandoned by the very system she served. Perhaps you could help clarify that situation." Rhodes straightened slightly, choosing her words with evident care. "Lieutenant Commander Winters' service record includes operations of the highest classification level. Her medical discharge involved complex security considerations that may have complicated her transition to civilian support systems." "Complicated," Alexandra repeated with quiet precision. "An interesting euphemism for systematic obstruction." The captain's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of genuine regret before it was carefully contained again. "There were concerns about potential security compromises during your dissociative episodes, Commander. Protocols were followed according to established procedure for personnel with your clearance level. Those protocols effectively erased her existence," Judge Garrett observed, his tone hardening. "Captain, my brother serves as Commander James Garrett with Naval Operations. He was at the embassy in Sana'a in 2014. Operation Broken Arrow." Rhodes stiffened visibly at the operation name, her eyes darting quickly between the judge and Alexandra. "That operation remains classified, Your Honor. I'm not at liberty to discuss—" "I'm not asking you to discuss operational details," Judge Garrett interrupted. "I'm stating that I'm aware of Lieutenant Commander Winters' contribution to an operation that saved my brother's life, among many others. What I want to know is why an officer of her standing was essentially discarded by the system she served." The direct question hung in the air between them. Rhodes seemed to be calculating her response carefully, institutional loyalty warring with personal discomfort at the situation before her. It was Alexandra who broke the silence, her voice carrying a detached professionalism that contrasted sharply with her appearance. "Operation Broken Arrow was more significant than publicly acknowledged. The intelligence I gathered and analyzed prevented not just casualties at the embassy, but a major international incident that would have compromised 3 ongoing covert operations across the region." She turned to Judge Garrett. "I received a Navy Cross in a classified ceremony that officially never happened. The citation exists in a file that cannot be accessed without clearances even I didn't possess." Rhodes made a small gesture of caution, which Alexandra acknowledged but ignored. "When my PTSD symptoms began interfering with operations, I was medically evacuated under a cover identity. The subsequent psychiatric evaluation revealed that discussing the source of my trauma would necessarily expose classified information." "A security dilemma," Rhodes interjected, seemingly eager to frame the situation in procedural terms. "Commander Winters couldn't receive effective treatment without disclosing classified details. But allowing such disclosure would violate multiple security protocols. So instead, she was simply cut loose without support," Judge Garrett concluded, making no effort to hide his disgust. "A convenient solution for everyone, except the commander herself." Rhodes had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It wasn't that simple, Your Honor. Attempts were made to establish specialized treatment protocols, but some preferred you remain unreachable," Alexandra finished, meeting Rhodes's eyes directly. "A security risk minimized through systematic neglect rather than active management. Less paperwork that way." The blunt assessment landed with palpable impact. Rhodes didn't deny it, her silence more damning than any protest might have been. Judge Garrett looked between them, the pieces falling into place. A decorated officer whose very existence had become an administrative inconvenience, easier to ignore than to properly support. The full weight of the injustice settled over the room, heavy and undeniable. Judge Garrett had seen many forms of systemic failure during his years on the bench, but few had struck him as profoundly as seeing a naval hero reduced to homelessness, while the institution she served effectively pretended she didn't exist. He made a decision then, rising from behind his desk with deliberate formality. Rhodes and Alexandra both watched him with cautious attention as he moved to stand directly before the seated former officer. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters. He addressed her with full military formality, his posture straightening into the precise bearing of his naval JAG days. Then, with perfect execution, he rendered a formal military salute, officer to officer, service member to service member, the highest acknowledgement of respect within military tradition. On behalf of a grateful nation and a particularly grateful family, I offer my profound respect and thanks for your service and sacrifice. The gesture hung in the air between them, powerful in its simplicity. For a moment, Alexandra remained frozen, the muscle memory of countless military exchanges warring with years of being treated as invisible. Then, slowly, she rose from her chair. Despite her ragged clothing and unwashed state, she drew herself to full attention, her bearing transforming completely as she returned the salute with perfect precision. The contrast was striking. A homeless woman in dirty donated clothing executing a flawless military salute with the dignity of her rank and training. It made the injustice of her situation all the more glaring. After a moment of hesitation, Rhodes joined them, rendering her own salute. Protocol demanded it, whatever her personal reservations or institutional loyalties. The three stood in momentary tableau, acknowledgement of shared service and obligation, transcending the circumstances that had brought them together. As they lowered their hands, Judge Garrett turned to Rhodes, his expression hardening once more. "Captain, I'm making an official judicial finding that a grievous injustice has been perpetrated upon Lieutenant Commander Winters by the very systems sworn to support her. This finding will be entered into the court record today." Rhodes's alarm was immediate. "Your Honor, there are sensitive security considerations that have been used to justify abandoning a decorated officer to the streets," he finished for her. "Those days are over. As of this moment, I am taking personal interest in ensuring Commander Winters receives every benefit and support to which her service entitles her." He returned to his desk, pulling a legal pad forward and beginning to write with quick, decisive strokes. "The criminal charges against Commander Winters are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm issuing a court order for immediate medical evaluation and treatment at Naval Medical Center San Diego, with all costs covered regardless of current administrative status." Alexandra watched this sudden advocacy with cautious hope, her military bearing still evident, but vulnerability showing through, as the judge continued outlining immediate interventions for her situation. "Your Honor," Rhodes attempted again, "while I appreciate your concern, there are procedures that must be followed. Commander Winters' security clearance status complicates—" "No, it doesn't," Judge Garrett interrupted firmly. "What complicates this situation is that a naval intelligence officer who saved American lives through her work has been living on the streets while the Navy pretended not to notice. That ends today." He looked up from his writing to fix Rhodes with a steely gaze. "Captain, you have exactly two options. You can facilitate Commander Winters' immediate access to appropriate medical care, housing, and full benefits while expediting resolution of her administrative complications. Or I can contact the San Diego Tribune with the story of how the Navy abandoned a decorated intelligence officer to homelessness because treating her PTSD was administratively inconvenient." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Rhodes's expression shifted through several emotions: indignation, calculation, and finally resignation. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor. I'll personally ensure Commander Winters receives immediate attention at Naval Medical." "Excellent." Judge Garrett's tone made it clear he would accept nothing less. "Bailiff Reynolds will accompany you both to ensure the commander's admission proceeds smoothly." He turned to Alexandra, his expression softening slightly. "Commander, I know this has been an unexpected turn of events. Are you willing to accept medical treatment at Naval Medical Center?" For the first time, genuine uncertainty showed in her expression. After years of systematic neglect, the sudden offer of institutional support clearly triggered warranted suspicion. "Will I be permitted to leave if treatment conditions prove unsatisfactory?" It was a revealing question, concerned not about medical procedures, but about potential confinement under the guise of care. Judge Garrett understood the fear immediately. "You are not in custody, Commander. This is not a commitment order. You're free to leave the facility at any time." He wrote something additional on his legal pad. Furthermore, I'm ordering that you be provided with a secure phone that connects directly to my chambers. Any issues with your treatment, any concerns at all, you call immediately. This additional safeguard seemed to ease her concerns somewhat. She nodded once. Decision made. I accept medical evaluation and initial treatment, with the condition that I maintain personal autonomy regarding ongoing care decisions. Noted and included in the order, Judge Garrett confirmed, continuing to write. Captain Rhodes, I'll expect daily updates on Commander Winters' status, beginning this evening. Rhodes nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with this level of judicial oversight, but seeing no alternative that wouldn't create greater complications. Of course, Your Honor. As Judge Garrett completed his written orders, Alexandra remained standing at formal attention, as if unwilling to relinquish the military bearing that had been her identity before homelessness stripped away her external markers of status and respect. Commander, he said gently, looking up from his writing, at ease, please. The simple command, so familiar from her years of service, seemed to release something within her. She shifted to parade rest, then gradually allowed her posture to relax into something less formal but still dignified. The transition was subtle but significant, a small reclamation of her military identity without the rigid formality that had been her primary defense mechanism during their interaction. One final matter before you depart, Judge Garrett said, signing the orders with a decisive flourish. The criminal charges brought against you are not merely dismissed, they are expunged. Your record will show no arrest, no charges filed. This incident will not appear in any background check or official documentation. It was a small thing, perhaps, compared to the larger injustices she had faced, but Alexandra's expression suggested it mattered, one less administrative obstacle in the already challenging path ahead. Thank you, Your Honor, she said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their brevity. As Reynolds prepared to escort them from chambers, Judge Garrett addressed one final comment to Rhodes. Captain, I meant what I said about maintaining contact with Commander Winters. If she disappears from treatment, if her benefits are mysteriously delayed again, if any aspect of her care falls short of what she's entitled to, I will not hesitate to use every resource at my disposal, legal, media, and political, to ensure accountability. Rhodes met his gaze directly, professional mask firmly in place, but with a new understanding of the situation's changed dynamics. Understood, Your Honor. The Navy takes care of its own. Starting today it does, he corrected pointedly. It's unfortunate it required judicial intervention to make that happen. As the door closed behind them, Judge Garrett remained standing behind his desk, the morning's events replaying in his mind. What had begun as a routine vagrant case had revealed itself as something far more significant. A glimpse into systemic failures that had allowed a decorated officer to fall through cracks so wide they constituted chasms. He reached for his phone, dialing a number from memory rather than from his contact list. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. James Garrett. James, it's Malcolm, the judge said, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately alerted his brother something significant had occurred. You need to come to San Diego, today if possible. I've just met the intelligence officer who saved your life in Sana'a. There was a momentary silence on the line as the implications of this statement registered. That's not possible. Those operations were classified, yes, Malcolm interrupted. Nevertheless, she's real, she's here, and until about an hour ago, she was homeless on the streets of San Diego because the system she served abandoned her rather than deal with the security complications of her PTSD treatment. Another pause. Longer this time. When Commander James Garrett spoke again, his voice carried the controlled anger of a naval officer confronting a situation fundamentally opposed to the principles of his service. Give me the details. I'll be on the next available flight. As Malcolm Garrett outlined the situation, he watched through his chamber window as Alexandra Winters was escorted to a waiting naval vehicle, her small frame dwarfed by the military personnel, now suddenly attentive to her needs. The contrast between her tattered appearance and their crisp uniforms was stark, a visual representation of the gap between promise and practice in the treatment of those who served. The system had failed her completely. Now, through the chance alignment of a courtroom assignment and a judge with personal connection to her service, she had become visible again, not just as a homeless Jane Doe to be processed and forgotten, but as Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Winters, Naval Intelligence Officer, recipient of classified valor decorations, a woman who had sacrificed her mental health and eventually her place in society for a country that had repaid her with systematic neglect. The injustice of it burned like acid in Judge Garrett's conscience, all the more so because he knew Alexandra Winters represented not an exception, but merely a visible example of a much larger pattern. For every homeless veteran whose identity and service record came to light through chance recognition, how many others remained invisible, their service forgotten, their needs unaddressed? It was a question that would haunt him long after this case was resolved, a question that demanded not just individual intervention, but systematic change. For now, though, he focused on the immediate task, ensuring that one veteran, at least, would receive the care and dignity she had earned through service and sacrifice. Naval Medical Center San Diego stood like a gleaming fortress on the hillside overlooking the bay. Its modern architecture, a testament to the nation's investment in military healthcare. Within its walls, some of the finest medical professionals in the country treated active duty personnel and veterans with state-of-the-art equipment and specialized expertise developed through decades of wartime medicine. 2 weeks after the courthouse revelation, Alexandra Winters sat by the window of a private room in the medical center's psychiatric wing. The transformation in her physical appearance was remarkable. Clean hair now revealed to be dark brown with premature silver streaks, cut in a practical shoulder-length style that framed features no longer obscured by dirt and desperation. Hospital-issued clothing had been replaced with simple but dignified civilian attire, dark slacks, a blue button-down shirt, and slip-on shoes that accommodated the still-healing blisters on her feet. Her posture remained military straight as she watched naval vessels move across the bay below, their disciplined purpose a sharp contrast to the aimless existence she had endured on the streets. The woman who had been discovered hunched and silent in Judge Garrett's courtroom was emerging from layers of protective withdrawal, though her eyes still carried the watchful caution of someone who had learned the hard way that systems designed to protect could just as easily abandon. A knock at the door preceded Judge Malcolm Garrett's entrance. He wore civilian clothes today rather than his judicial robes, a concession to the informal nature of this visit, which fell outside his official duties but squarely within the personal commitment he had made to her case. "Commander," he greeted her with genuine warmth, "you're looking well." It wasn't mere politeness. The medical care of the past 2 weeks had begun to restore her physical health. Proper nutrition had already begun filling the hollows of her cheeks, while regular sleep in a safe environment had softened the perpetual vigilance in her expression. "Judge Garrett," she acknowledged, rising to greet him with ingrained military courtesy. "Thank you for coming." He gestured for her to sit again as he took the chair opposite. "Please, it's Malcolm outside the courtroom. How are you finding the accommodations?" Alexandra considered the question with the careful assessment that seemed fundamental to her nature. The medical care is excellent, the staff professional, security protocols appropriate without being restrictive. The precise evaluation, delivered like a mission report, revealed much about her ongoing mental framework. Even in recovery, she processed her environment through the lens of her training, assessing, analyzing, identifying potential issues with methodical thoroughness. "And your treatment plan?" he asked, noting a folder on the bedside table that likely contained her medical information. "Physical recovery proceeding efficiently, nutritional deficiencies being addressed, sleep patterns improving with medication." She paused, then added with subtle emphasis, "Psychiatric evaluation ongoing, though complicated by clearance limitations regarding discussion of causal incidents." The last point represented the persistent challenge in her case. Even here, in a facility with high security clearances, the classified nature of the operations that had traumatized her created barriers to comprehensive treatment. Some improvement could be achieved through general PTSD protocols, but full recovery required addressing specific experiences that remained restricted information. "I've been making inquiries about that," Judge Garrett informed her. "My brother James has connections at the Pentagon who may be able to facilitate a treatment team with appropriate clearances. The process is bureaucratically complex, but we're making progress." Alexandra nodded once, acknowledgement rather than enthusiasm. After years of systematic disappointment, she maintained careful reserve about promises of institutional support, regardless of who made them. "There's been significant media interest in your case," he continued, changing the subject. Not you specifically. We've maintained your privacy. But in the broader issue of homeless veterans with complex service records being denied appropriate care, several senators are calling for oversight hearings on the VA's handling of classified service records. A flicker of something like satisfaction crossed her features. Good. Systemic change requires public pressure. Individual interventions help one person. Policy changes help thousands. Her focus on the broader implications rather than her personal situation confirmed Judge Garrett's growing understanding of her character. Despite everything she had endured, her concern remained with the mission rather than herself. In this case, the mission of ensuring other veterans wouldn't face the same abandonment. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. The door opened to reveal a woman in her mid-30s, professionally dressed in a cardigan and slacks, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Though she wore no uniform, something in her bearing suggested military-family connection. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who grew up in the Midwest. "The nurse said I could come in." Alexandra's expression shifted dramatically as she recognized the visitor, not the careful neutrality she maintained with hospital staff, or even the measured respect she showed Judge Garrett, but genuine emotional response. "Savannah," she said, the single word carrying volumes of meaning. "Lexa," the woman responded, using a nickname that humanized the formal lieutenant commander in a way Judge Garrett hadn't yet witnessed. "I finally found you." Judge Garrett rose immediately, recognizing the significance of this reunion. "I should give you privacy." "No, please stay," Alexandra said with uncharacteristic urgency. "Savannah, this is Judge Malcolm Garrett. He's the reason I'm here instead of back on the street. Judge, this is Dr. Savannah Winters, my sister." The introduction confirmed what the shared features had already suggested. Despite different career paths and the visible toll that Alexandra's experiences had taken, the family resemblance was unmistakable in the shape of their eyes and the determined set of their jaws. "Dr. Winters," Judge Garrett acknowledged, extending his hand. "I had no idea Alexandra had family searching for her." Savannah shook his hand firmly, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and lingering distress. "For 3 years," she confirmed, but her military records were classified. They wouldn't tell me anything, not where she had been discharged, not what medical facilities might have treated her, not even confirmation that she was no longer active duty. It was like she had been erased. The frustration in her voice was palpable, the anguish of someone who had exhausted every avenue trying to locate a loved one, only to be blocked at every turn by bureaucratic barriers and security protocols. "How did you find me now?" Alexandra asked, the question direct but her tone gentler than Judge Garrett had heard from her before. "A colleague at Johns Hopkins has a husband in the Navy," Savannah explained, moving closer to her sister, though not yet attempting physical contact. "He saw an internal memo about a classified personnel case being reactivated at Naval Medical San Diego. The name was redacted, but there was mention of a court case in San Diego involving a formerly homeless veteran with intelligence background. I took a chance." Judge Garrett watched the sisters absorb each other's presence, the emotional current between them powerful despite their restrained expressions. Both showed the careful control that suggested early military family life, yet the connection was undeniable. "I'll give you privacy to reconnect," he said, moving toward the door. "Commander, I'll check in tomorrow with any updates on the clearance issue for your treatment team." Alexandra looked up at him, and for the first time since he had met her, something like genuine hope showed in her expression. "Thank you, Judge Garrett, for everything." The simple acknowledgement carried weight beyond its words, recognition not just of his recent advocacy, but of the basic human dignity of seeing her as a person when others had rendered her invisible. He nodded once and departed, leaving the sisters to begin the complex process of reconnection after years of enforced separation. Outside in the corridor, Judge Garrett paused to gather his thoughts. The case of Alexandra Winters had expanded far beyond a simple courthouse encounter, becoming a personal mission that now encompassed not only her individual recovery, but potentially systemic reform. His phone buzzed with a message from his brother James, indicating his arrival at the medical center after meetings at the Pentagon regarding Alexandra's security clearance issues. They met in the hospital's courtyard garden, a carefully maintained space designed to provide respite for patients and visitors. Commander James Garrett had the same military bearing as his brother, though his active duty status was evident in his physical conditioning and regulation haircut. At 48, he carried the confidence of a naval officer who had earned his position through demonstrated competence rather than political maneuvering. "How is she?" James asked, without preamble, as they sat on a bench partially secluded by ornamental grasses. "Physically improving," Malcolm replied, mentally still guarded, understandably so. "Her sister just arrived. Apparently she's been searching for Alexandra for years, but couldn't get past the classification barriers." James nodded, unsurprised by this information. The system is designed to protect operational security, not facilitate family connections. Once someone enters the classified service pipeline, their entire existence becomes compartmentalized. It's necessary for certain operations, but creates devastating gaps when someone falls through the cracks. This was more than falling through cracks, James. This was systematic abandonment of a decorated officer because her trauma became administratively inconvenient. The blunt assessment hung between them, neither brother disputing its accuracy. James had spent the 2 weeks since learning of Alexandra's situation, leveraging every connection he had within naval operations to understand how such a failure had occurred. The answers he found had only deepened his concern about broader systemic issues affecting other veterans with classified service records. "I've spoken with Admiral Hargrove," James said after a moment. "He's agreed to come personally to address Commander Winters' situation." Malcolm raised an eyebrow in surprise. Admiral Joseph Hargrove was a significant figure in naval operations, his involvement suggesting the case had triggered high-level attention. "That's unexpected. Why the personal interest?" "Apparently he knew Alexandra during her intelligence operations. Can't discuss details, but he was directly involved in the Broken Arrow aftermath. When he learned she had been living homeless, he was—" James paused, searching for an appropriate description. "Incandescent with controlled fury." Before Malcolm could respond, they were approached by a naval officer in full-dress uniform. Despite being in his mid-60s, Admiral Joseph Hargrove carried himself with the vitality of a man who had maintained rigorous physical standards throughout his career. His expression was grave as he greeted the Garrett brothers with formal courtesy. "Judge Garrett, Commander Garrett, thank you both for your intervention in this matter. The situation with Lieutenant Commander Winters represents a failure that demands immediate correction." The Admiral's directness was refreshing after weeks of bureaucratic evasion from other naval representatives. Malcolm gestured to the bench, inviting the senior officer to join their conversation. "I've just come from a preliminary meeting with Commander Winters' medical team," Hargrove informed them, taking a seat. "The complexity of her case is significant, but not insurmountable. I've authorized emergency protocols to assign treatment specialists with appropriate clearances, effective immediately." "That's welcome news," Malcolm acknowledged, though it raises the question of why such protocols weren't implemented when she was initially diagnosed with PTSD. Admiral Hargrove's expression tightened. "A valid question deserving honest answer. The system failed Commander Winters at multiple points. Her transition from classified operations to medical discharge occurred during an administrative reorganization that fragmented accountability. Her case officers changed repeatedly, each passing responsibility without ensuring continuity of care. The explanation, while forthright, struck Malcolm as insufficient. Administrative reorganization doesn't explain 3 years of neglect, followed by 14 months of homelessness for a decorated intelligence officer. "No, it doesn't," Hargrove agreed, surprising both brothers with his candor. "The full explanation involves institutional priorities that placed operational security above personnel welfare, budget constraints that incentivize dropping complex cases, and frank institutional bias against mental health conditions. These are not excuses, merely contributors to a systemic failure we must now address." The Admiral's willingness to acknowledge fundamental flaws rather than offer bureaucratic justifications suggested genuine commitment to reform. He continued with the direct approach of someone accustomed to confronting difficult operational realities. "I've initiated a comprehensive review of all classified veteran benefit claims currently in administrative limbo. Preliminary findings suggest Commander Winters' case, while extreme, is not unique. We've identified at least 17 other veterans with similar classification complications affecting their access to appropriate care. This confirmation of broader systemic failure matched Malcolm's suspicion that Alexandra represented merely the visible portion of a much larger problem. What happens to those 17 cases now? Each receives expedited review with my direct oversight, Hargrove stated firmly. Additionally, I'm implementing new protocols for transitioning classified personnel to veteran status. Security concerns remain valid, but they cannot supersede our obligation to those who served. As they continued discussing specific reforms, a nurse approached to inform them that Commander Winters was asking to see all three of them. They found her in the hospital's small conference room rather than her patient room, seated beside her sister at a table arranged for a formal meeting. Though still in civilian clothes, Alexandra's posture and expression had shifted subtly toward her military bearing, a commander prepared to engage with senior leadership rather than a patient receiving visitors. Admiral Hargrove, she acknowledged as they entered, rising with ingrained military courtesy despite her medical status. Commander Winters, he returned formally, rendering appropriate respect, rather than the condescension often shown to patients. It's been too long. Alexandra's sister Savannah remained seated, her protective posture suggesting she had developed strong opinions about military hierarchy during her search for her sister. She watched the admiral with undisguised skepticism, a civilian unmoved by rank insignia after years of bureaucratic stonewalling. I understand you're implementing reforms based on my case, Alexandra stated directly, dispensing with preliminaries. I want to be involved in that process. The request might have seemed presumptuous coming from a junior officer addressing an admiral, but circumstances had reshaped conventional military dynamics. Alexandra Winters had earned unique moral authority through her service and subsequent abandonment by the system. Admiral Hargrove acknowledged this with a nod. Your perspective would be invaluable. What did you have in mind? Congressional testimony, she replied without hesitation. Not about operational details, but about the systematic failures in transitioning classified personnel to veteran status. The gaps need to be identified publicly to ensure reforms aren't quietly abandoned when media attention fades. Her strategic thinking remained sharp despite everything she had endured, focusing not on personal redress, but on systemic change with lasting impact. It reinforced Malcolm's growing understanding that Alexandra's intelligence background had shaped more than just her professional skills. It had fundamentally influenced how she approached problem-solving at every level. Testimony carries risks, Hargrove cautioned. Even without operational details, your public identification as former intelligence personnel creates security concerns. With respect, Admiral, I spent 14 months homeless on the streets of San Diego. If foreign intelligence services wanted to exploit me, they had ample opportunity while I was at my most vulnerable. Security risk mitigation now feels like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. The blunt assessment, delivered with professional calm rather than bitterness, landed effectively. Admiral Hargrove conceded the point with a slight nod. A fair observation. I'll facilitate appropriate clearance for limited testimony focused on transition protocols rather than operations. Your first-hand experience would be compelling evidence for the Oversight Committee. The discussion continued, shifting from Alexandra's potential congressional testimony to immediate improvements in her treatment plan. Throughout, she maintained professional focus, asking pointed questions about timelines and accountability measures to ensure promised reforms would actually materialize. Only occasionally did her gaze drift to the window overlooking the bay, as if reassuring herself that she had indeed emerged from the invisible existence she had endured for so long. 6 months later, the San Diego Naval Memorial presented a very different scene from the day of Alexandra's arrest. Morning sunlight gleamed on polished granite and bronze, highlighting the names of those who had served and sacrificed across generations of naval service. The memorial grounds were meticulously maintained, flowers adding color to the dignified space designed for reflection and remembrance. Alexandra Winters approached carrying a single white rose, her appearance now fully transformed from the desperate woman who had once been arrested for trespassing at this very location. Dressed in simple but dignified civilian clothes, she walked with the straight posture of her military background, no longer needing to hunch protectively or hide her identity. She placed the flower precisely at the base of the memorial, not a random gesture, but a deliberate placement before a specific name etched in stone. It was a personal ritual maintained from her days of homelessness, but now conducted openly with dignity rather than fear of removal. Judge Malcolm Garrett watched from a respectful distance, waiting until she had completed her private moment before approaching for their scheduled meeting. In the months since their courthouse encounter, their professional connection had evolved into something approaching friendship, bound by shared commitment to reforming the systems that had failed her and countless others. "Still coming on Tuesdays," he observed as he joined her, noting the significance of the day that had once been her intelligence briefing schedule with the SEAL teams. "Some rituals provide continuity," she acknowledged, though now it's by choice rather than compulsion. They walked together along the memorial's winding path, an informal setting for discussion of formal progress. Alexandra's recovery continued steadily. Her physical health restored, though her psychological healing followed a more complex trajectory. The specialized treatment team with appropriate security clearances had finally allowed her to address specific traumas rather than trying to heal around classified gaps in her narrative. "The Veterans Justice Outreach Program accepted my application," she informed him, referring to the position he had suggested during her early recovery. "I start next month, identifying homeless veterans in the legal system before they fall through the cracks." "They couldn't ask for someone more qualified," Malcolm noted with genuine approval. "Your personal experience combined with your analytical background makes you uniquely effective." Alexandra nodded acknowledgement without false modesty. She had always assessed her capabilities with clear-eyed precision, neither overstating nor diminishing her skills. That same analytical approach now directed her energy towards systematic identification of other veterans at risk of institutional abandonment. 3 more veterans with classified service records were identified in court yesterday, she reported. 2 already in treatment programs, 1 still being processed. The new protocols are working, though implementation remains inconsistent between jurisdictions. "Progress," Malcolm observed, though not yet victory. "Systems change slowly," she agreed, "but they do change when people within them care enough to make it happen." Their conversation turned to her upcoming congressional testimony, scheduled for the following month. The security clearance issues had been resolved through careful negotiation of boundaries. She could discuss the systemic failures in transitioning classified personnel to veteran status without revealing operational details that remained protected. Her testimony would provide crucial first-hand evidence for lawmakers considering reforms to veteran care protocols. "Are you nervous about the public attention?" Malcolm asked as they completed their circuit of the memorial grounds. Alexandra considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Not nervous. Focused. This isn't about my recognition. It's for the others still out there, invisible within the system, or abandoned by it entirely." As they approached the memorial entrance, they noticed a police officer standing near the pathway. Alexandra tensed momentarily, an instinctive reaction to law enforcement after her experiences, before recognizing the specific individual. It was the same officer who had arrested her for trespassing months earlier, though he didn't immediately appear to recognize her, given her transformed appearance. When understanding dawned on his face, the moment hung with potential tension. The officer hesitated, clearly uncertain how to navigate this unexpected encounter with someone he had once processed as just another homeless troublemaker, now clearly rehabilitated and in the company of a respected judge. Instead of avoiding the interaction, Alexandra approached him directly. "Officer Mercer," she greeted him, reading his nameplate. "Good morning." "Ma'am," he responded, recognition and discomfort evident in his expression. "You're looking—" He paused, searching for appropriate words. "Much better." "Proper medical care and housing make a significant difference," she observed without sarcasm, stating simple fact. The officer's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine regret. "I owe you an apology, Commander. When I arrested you, I didn't see you. I just saw a problem to remove. I should have asked more questions, looked more carefully." The sincere acknowledgement seemed to affect Alexandra more deeply than Malcolm had anticipated. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, genuine emotion briefly visible before she regained control. "Many of us become invisible after the uniform comes off," she replied, neither absolving nor condemning. "The system trains us all to focus on surface presentations rather than underlying realities." Officer Mercer nodded, accepting this framing. I've joined the training program you helped design for first responders. Learning to identify veterans in crisis, asking the right questions, it's changing how we approach these situations. This information clearly pleased her, though she remained characteristically reserved in her response. Good. Systemic change requires educating all points of contact, not just medical and benefits personnel. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small group gathering near the memorial entrance. Veterans and volunteers preparing for an outreach operation to locate and assist homeless veterans throughout the city. Alexandra checked her watch, then turned to Malcolm. "Our team is assembling. Would you like to join the briefing?" "I'd be honored," he replied, genuinely impressed by how quickly she had transitioned from receiving assistance to providing it for others. As they approached the group, Malcolm noticed the easy authority with which Alexandra was greeted, not as a former patient or homeless person who had received charity, but as a respected leader whose insights carried particular weight. She had found her footing in a role that leveraged both her intelligence background and her lived experience, creating unique value from what might have remained a tragic waste of capability. "This is Judge Garrett," she introduced him to the assembled team. "He's the judge who remembered to look beyond what he first saw." The simple introduction carried significant meaning for both of them. Acknowledgement that Alexandra might still be on the streets if not for that moment of recognition in his courtroom, but delivered without diminishing her own agency in her recovery. "I almost made the same mistake as everyone else," Malcolm admitted to the group with humility. "The system trains us all to process rather than perceive." The outreach team consisted of veterans, medical professionals, and social workers, each bringing specific expertise to the complex challenge of identifying and assisting homeless veterans, particularly those whose service records complicated their access to benefits. Their discussion revealed how much had changed in the 6 months since Alexandra's case had triggered systematic review of veteran care protocols. The new identification system flags veterans with classified service backgrounds for specialized case management, a VA representative explained. No more getting bounced between departments because nobody can access their complete records. And the secure treatment protocols are being implemented at 5 additional facilities nationwide, added a psychiatric nurse. Veterans can now discuss classified experiences with appropriately cleared therapists without security violations. These concrete improvements, directly resulting from Alexandra's case and subsequent advocacy, represented real progress rather than merely symbolic gestures. Lives would be saved, suffering reduced, dignity restored to those who had sacrificed for their country, only to be abandoned by bureaucratic convenience. As the team prepared to depart for their day's outreach work, Alexandra stepped forward to deliver final instructions. Her natural leadership emerged without effort, the authority in her voice born of both professional training and personal experience with the challenges they were addressing. "Our mission is simple," she told the assembled group. "No one who served remains invisible. No one gets left behind." The team dispersed to begin their work, leaving Alexandra and Malcolm standing at the memorial entrance. They shared a moment of quiet acknowledgement, former judge and former defendant now united in common purpose despite their vastly different paths to this moment. As Alexandra prepared to join her team, Malcolm offered a formal military salute, not the first he had given her, but perhaps the most meaningful. This was no longer a gesture of belated recognition for past service, but acknowledgement of ongoing mission, of purpose reclaimed and dignity restored. Alexandra returned the salute with perfect military precision, the gesture symbolizing her journey from invisible to honored, from abandoned to essential. Then she turned to join her team, heading out to find others who, like her, needed only to be truly seen to begin their journey back from the shadows.